Judith Ann Neely. In 1983, an 18-year-old woman was sentenced to death in Alabama, which made her the youngest woman on death row anywhere in the country at that time. More than 40 years have passed since then, and she is still behind bars. Every time she has come close to a way out, the state has moved to close it. Judith Ann Adams was born in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and her early life came apart quickly. Her father, who struggled with alcohol, died in a motorcycle accident when she was 9. At 15, she married Alvin Neely, a man of 26, and the two of them began a run of armed robberies that carried them across the country. By the time she was 18, she was already a mother of 3. In the fall of 1982, the couple took a young girl from a shopping mall in Rome, Georgia. She lived at a home for children who had been removed from difficult circumstances, and she had been out on a supervised group trip when she was taken. The couple held her for several days at a motel across the state line in Alabama. On September 28th, at a place called Little River Canyon, Judith took her life, and afterward she phoned the police herself to tell them where the body could be found. A little more than a week later, the Neelys approached an engaged couple back in Rome. Judith wounded the man, John Hancock, who survived and would later identify them both. His fiancée, Janice Chapman, did not survive. The young girl the couple had taken from the mall had spent much of her short life being moved from one place to another. Family members remembered that she loved music and that she would play one favorite song again and again. She had talked about wanting to become a doctor one day. She was looked after at a Methodist home in Cedartown, and it was from there that she left on the trip she never came back from. Because John Hancock lived, the investigation had something that a case like this almost never gets: a survivor who could describe the people responsible. A detective followed the couple for roughly 3 weeks before closing in on them in Tennessee. Judith was arrested in early October of 1982, and Alvin was taken into custody days after that. So how did a teenager end up condemned to death when the jury that heard her case did not ask for it? Her trial began on March 7, 1983, in Fort Payne, in DeKalb County. The jury that convicted her recommended a sentence of life without parole by a vote of 10-2. The judge, Randall Cole, set that recommendation aside and imposed death instead. In Georgia, she later pleaded guilty in the Chapman case in exchange for her testimony against her husband, and she received a life sentence there. Alvin pleaded guilty in Georgia as well to avoid a death sentence of his own, and he was never tried in the young girl's case at all. The trial also produced the portrait of Judith Neely that would define how she was understood for decades afterward. A forensic psychiatrist named Michael Stone, who spent years studying offenders and ranking them according to the severity of what they had done, placed her in the most extreme category on the scale he developed. That assessment, more than any single fact of the case, is what fixed her in the public mind as one of the worst offenders the country had produced. What is less often mentioned is how long her legal fight went on and who carried it. For roughly 30 years, she was represented by an attorney named Barry Ragsdale, who took the case without charge and pursued it through appeal after appeal, long after the wider public had stopped paying attention. Her appeals moved slowly and went nowhere. A request for a new trial was denied in 1987, and by 1989, the United States Supreme Court had effectively allowed the death sentence to stand. Then, on January 15, 1999, his final day in office, Governor Fob James commuted her sentence to life with the possibility of parole. He did it quietly, without consulting the district attorney or the state attorney general, on the very day the state had asked for an execution date to be set. That single decision has shaped everything that followed. In 2003, Alabama passed a law aimed squarely at keeping her from ever being paroled. A law written for one person. Courts later struck it down, ruling that a state cannot write a law aimed at punishing a single named person, and after years of federal litigation, she won the right to be considered for parole after all. When those hearings finally came, they did not go her way. She was denied in 2018, and again on May 25, 2023, when the state parole board voted unanimously against her in under 3 minutes. Ahead of that hearing, Governor Kay Ivey wrote that Judith Neely should never be allowed to set foot outside an Alabama prison. As of 2026, she remains at the Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Wetumpka, Alabama, and her next chance at parole will not come until May of 2028. Alvin Neely died in a Georgia prison in 2005. In the years since, Alabama passed what is known as Lisa's Law, named for the young girl taken from the mall to keep convicted offenders from profiting off their crimes. And the state later moved to require that a governor notify a victim's family before commuting a sentence again. The former district attorney, Mike Odell, has spoken publicly about the way that commutation was handled, describing a decision reached without any warning to the prosecutors who had actually tried the case. Her crimes have been revisited on television programs devoted to criminal psychology and in a book written about the case, which is part of the reason a case from 1982 still resurfaces in public conversation more than 40 years on. Judith Neely never carried out her crimes alone. She had a partner in her husband, and much of the horror of her case came from two people steering each other toward something neither of them might have done by themselves. That same dynamic, a married couple turning their shared life into a shared crime, would surface again decades later in a small Pennsylvania city. Only this time, the marriage was just weeks old. Miranda Barber. 3 weeks after their wedding, a young married couple in central Pennsylvania placed an ad online offering female companionship for money. The man who answered it was driven to a quiet street, and he never came home. And when the young wife was finally in custody, she made a claim that traveled around the world, one that almost no one who actually knew her believed. Miranda Barber had grown up far from Pennsylvania, in North Pole, Alaska, and by her late teens, she was already a young mother. She married Elite Barber in North Carolina in October of 2013, and the two of them moved to central Pennsylvania only about 3 weeks before the killing. She was 18 years old. Whatever ordinary life a newlywed couple is supposed to be starting, the Barbers were planning something else. Her own account of her early years was a bleak one. She said she had been harmed by a relative during her childhood, and her mother later confirmed that an uncle had been convicted of an offense against a child and sentenced to 19 years in prison. Whether any of that history explains what she went on to do is a question the courts never had to weigh, because it was never offered as a legal defense on her behalf. What the record shows instead is a young woman who had moved across the country with a new husband and, within weeks of arriving, went looking for a stranger to harm. On November 11, 2013, they drew a man named Troy LaFerrara to them through a Craigslist ad that offered companionship for $100. Miranda picked him up at a mall in Hummel's Wharf and drove toward the city of Sunbury. What LaFerrara did not know was that Elite was hidden under a blanket in the back seat the entire time. On a signal the couple had agreed on beforehand, a single phrase. Elite looped a cord around the man's neck while Miranda used a knife. According to the police affidavit, LaFerrara was strangled and stabbed. Afterward, the couple left his body behind a home in Sunbury, bought cleaning supplies, and went out to dinner. When Elite finally spoke to investigators, he told them the two of them had simply wanted to take a life together, for no reason beyond the act itself. Troy LaFerrara was 42 years old, and he had built the kind of steady, respected life that makes a loss like this land hard. He was a Penn State graduate and a licensed professional engineer who worked as a senior resident engineer at a county landfill. He had married his wife Colleen 2 years earlier after a long relationship. Away from work, he was a careful outdoorsman who taught hunter safety courses to others. LaFerrara's body was found the next day, November 12th, in a residential backyard on Catawissa Avenue. He had no obvious connection to the neighborhood where he turned up, and that in itself gave investigators a place to start. When they pulled his phone records, the last call he ever received traced straight back to Miranda. At first, both barbers denied even knowing him. Then their account shifted, from a claim of self-defense to something far colder, a mutual admission that the whole thing had been planned in advance. Miranda was arrested on December 3rd, and Elite 3 days later, and each of them ended up describing to police a killing that had been agreed on before LaFerrara ever got into the car. What could push two people to turn a stranger into a target simply to see it done? Both were initially charged with first-degree murder, which in Pennsylvania can carry the death penalty. In the end, they each pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, which carries a mandatory life term, and that arrangement took the death penalty off the table. On September 18, 2014, Northumberland County Judge Charles Saylor sentenced both of them to life without parole, telling the court that removing them from society for good was the right outcome. LaFerrara's widow and his sister spoke at that hearing, and his sister told the courtroom that the two people responsible were rotten to the core. For the family, the sentencing was the closest thing to an answer they would receive, because no explanation offered in court ever made the loss make sense. But it was something Miranda said from jail that turned her into an international headline. In an interview early in 2014, she claimed she had taken part in at least 22 killings over roughly 6 years, spread across several states. And she said that once she reached that number, she simply stopped counting. The claim spread quickly, and for a short time, it reframed her in the public imagination as a possible serial killer. But it did not hold up to any scrutiny. The police chief in Sunbury said his investigators had passed what she told them along to the FBI's Philadelphia division. And the answer that came back was that it was far too early to say whether she had been involved in anything at all. In the years since, no case anywhere in the country has been tied to her, and no family has ever been told that a missing relative was accounted for because of something she said. The district attorney went further and stated there was no verification for any part of the claim. And the people who knew her best, her own mother, father, and sister, described her as a manipulative liar who invented stories. To this day, none of it has ever been substantiated, and it belongs in the record as an unproven claim rather than a fact. Miranda later tried to have her sentence reconsidered in 2018, arguing for a second look at the life term, but the court left it in place and the sentence held. As of 2026, both she and Elite remain in Pennsylvania prisons, with Miranda held at a state facility in Muncie, and neither of them has any realistic path back out. Miranda Barber's story was built partly on a killing she chose, and partly on a body count that seems to have existed only in her own words. The young woman who comes next carried the opposite kind of weight. Her crime was undeniably real, but she spent the rest of her long life insisting that the death at the center of it was never something she meant to cause in a Pennsylvania courtroom more than 4 decades earlier. Sharon Wiggins. At 17, She became one of the youngest women ever sentenced to death in the state of Pennsylvania. She would go on to spend more than 4 decades behind bars, earn a college degree, and help run an education program inside the very prison that held her. And she would die in her cell just months before a decision came down that might finally have opened the door to her release. Sharon Margaret Wiggins, known for most of her life as Peachy, grew up in the Hill District of Pittsburgh in deep poverty. The grandmother who raised her died when Sharon was 14, and after that she spent stretches of her teenage years homeless, without much of anyone to catch her. By 17, she had fallen in with 2 young men and a plan that would define everything that came after. What actually happened was over in seconds, but it followed her for 42 years. On December 2nd, 1968, Wiggins and 2 co-defendants, Foster Tarver, who was 17, and Samuel Barlow, who was 18, robbed the Dauphin Deposit Trust Company in Harrisburg and left with more than $70,000. As the robbery was unfolding, a 64-year-old customer named George Morlock walked in. Morlock, who was deaf, took hold of Wiggins, and in the struggle she fired. A co-defendant fired more shots as well, and Morlock was killed. For the rest of her life, Wiggins maintained that the gun went off by accident the moment he grabbed her, and that she never intended for anyone to die that day. George Morlock was 64 years old, a bank customer who happened to walk into the middle of an armed robbery. He was deaf, and rather than stand aside, he chose to step in. Very little else about him has been widely recorded. What is remembered is that he tried to intervene, and it cost him his life. How does a 17-year-old end up on death row for a death she swore to the end she never intended? All 3 defendants pleaded guilty. A panel of 3 judges sentenced each of them to death, which placed Wiggins among the youngest women ever condemned to die in Pennsylvania. It is worth pausing on how unusual that outcome was. Pennsylvania in the late 1960s still had a working death chamber, and because all 3 defendants had pleaded guilty rather than go to trial, no jury ever weighed in on whether any of them should live. The decision rested entirely with 3 judges. A teenager who had been sleeping wherever she could find a place only months earlier was placed in a cell to wait for an execution date that, as it turned out, would never be set. She sat on death row beginning in 1969, a teenager waiting to be executed. In the years that followed, her sentence was reduced to life without parole, and it came about through several forces arriving at once. The NAACP appealed to the governor, clergy members protested, and Pennsylvania elected Governor Milton Shapp, who opposed the death penalty. All of it landed shortly before the Supreme Court's decision in Furman v. Georgia in 1972, which paused capital punishment across the country. What might have been an execution became, instead, a life sentence. What Wiggins did with the decades that followed set her apart from almost anyone in her position. She spent roughly 42 years at the state prison in Muncie, which by most accounts made her the longest-serving female juvenile lifer in Pennsylvania, and by the reckoning of some advocates, the longest anywhere in the world. She earned a degree from Penn State and went on to work as an administrator there, coordinating the prison's college program and serving as a liaison for the students inside it. And she paid her own room and board out of the salary she made doing it, something believed to be unique in the country. In 2009, the Pennsylvania Prison Society named her its Prisoner of the Year. Over the years, she applied for commutation 13 separate times, and each time the answer came back no. The program she helped run was not a token arrangement. The women enrolled in it took genuine college coursework, and Wiggins served as the link between them and the university, handling the scheduling and the paperwork that kept the whole thing functioning from one year to the next. Staff and students alike came to treat her as the steady center of that part of the prison, the person who had been there longer than anyone and who knew how everything worked. For a woman with no realistic prospect of release, building something that would outlast her own sentence was the only kind of future available to her, and she spent decades doing exactly that. None of it was enough to free her. On March 24, 2013, Sharon Wiggins died of a heart attack in her cell at the age of 62. The timing carried its own kind of cruelty. Only months earlier, in June of 2012, the Supreme Court had ruled in Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life without parole for juveniles was unconstitutional, the exact kind of ruling that might have reopened her case. After more than 4 decades of being told no, the law had finally shifted in a direction that could have helped her, and she did not live long enough to see whether it would. She died before she could ever benefit from it. She was buried in Detroit, and one of her co-defendants, Foster Tarver, was later paroled in 2018, walking out of prison years after the woman he had robbed that bank with had run out of time. As of 2026, her life is preserved in an archive at Penn State, established 2 years after her passing, a record of a woman remembered less for the robbery than for what she built in the decades that came after it. Sharon Wiggins spent more than 40 years trying to become someone other than the teenager who walked into that bank, and by nearly every account, she succeeded. There is no similar record of change in the case that follows. A court would describe the young woman at its center not as someone who reformed, but as the person who set a night of violence in motion, one that took the lives of members of a single family stopped at a rest area in the hills of Tennessee. Natasha Cornett. In the spring of 1997, 6 young people traveling through Tennessee crossed paths with a family at an interstate rest stop. By the end of that night, 3 members of that family were gone, and one of the 6, an 18-year-old a court would later describe as the one who set it all in motion, was on her way toward a sentence that has never been undone. Natasha Cornett had grown up poor in Pike County, Kentucky, raised by a single mother near the town of Pikeville. She had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. She left school before the 9th grade, and by her late teens, she had immersed herself in a dark subculture that unsettled the people around her. She was 18 at the time of the crime. Within the small group she traveled with, she was, by the account of the court that later reviewed the case, the central figure. On April 6, 1997, Cornett and 5 companions stopped at a rest area along Interstate 81 near Greenville. The 5 who traveled with her were Karen Howell, who was 17, Crystal Sturgill, who was 18, Joseph Reisner, who was 20, Edward Dean Mullins, who was 19, and a 6th member of the group who was only 14. They had left Kentucky together with almost no money between them and no destination beyond a loose idea of reaching New Orleans, or perhaps crossing into Mexico. The group had been drifting away from lives of boredom and poverty, and what they wanted was the family's van. The father, Vidar Lillelid, approached the group to talk with them about his faith. Instead of a conversation, the family was forced into the van at gunpoint and driven to a quiet road nearby. There, the parents and one of their children lost their lives. The youngest child survived. Court testimony pointed to the youngest member of the group as the one who carried it out. Though which of them was truly responsible has remained in dispute among the 6 to this day. Vidar Lillelid had been born in Norway, and his wife Delphina was Honduran American. The 2 of them were Jehovah's Witnesses, and on that day, they were traveling home with their 2 young children after a religious convention. Vidar had approached the strangers at the rest stop for the simplest of reasons. to share something he believed in. That decision placed his family in the group's path. The six were caught only 2 days later, stopped near the Arizona border as they tried to cross into Mexico in the stolen van. Several of the family's belongings still with them. When investigators pieced the group together, it turned out to be an uneven mix of teenagers and young adults who had left Kentucky together with almost nothing, and who had, in the span of a single stop, turned a chance encounter into a case that would follow every one of them for the rest of their lives. From the beginning, the accounts they gave conflicted, and they have conflicted ever since, each of the six placing the heaviest weight of what happened on someone other than themselves. How does the law divide responsibility for something carried out by 6 people at once? Facing the possibility of death sentences for the 4 who were adults, all 6 pleaded guilty in February of 1998. They admitted to 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted first-degree murder, along with kidnapping and theft, in exchange for the state setting the death penalty aside. After a sentencing hearing that stretched across a week, each of them received 3 consecutive terms of life without parole, plus an additional 25 years connected to the child who survived. One of the 6, Crystal Sturgill, later had her sentences adjusted on appeal to run at the same time rather than one after another, in recognition of a lesser role. The prosecutor who handled the case, Berkeley Bell, would later describe it as the defining case of his career, and said plainly that what had driven it was evil. That framing stuck, and it is part of why the case is still discussed in Tennessee decades later. 3 consecutive life sentences is a punishment designed to be mathematically impossible to outlive. And it was handed down to teenagers and young adults who had, by their own admission, set out that morning with nothing more organized than a wish to get somewhere else. The appeals have almost all failed. The sentences were upheld by a Tennessee appeals court in 2000. 2 of the 6 had been under 18 at the time, and their cases became part of a much larger legal shift. In 2012, the Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life without parole for juveniles was unconstitutional, and a few years later, it made that ruling retroactive, which opened the door for offenders sentenced as teenagers to ask for new hearings. Those 2 members of the group tried exactly that. A Greene County judge denied one of the bids in 2017, and in late 2024, the Tennessee Supreme Court refused to revisit it. The efforts of the youngest member of the group in the federal courts also came to nothing. It is worth noting that even a sentence of life with parole in Tennessee requires serving decades before a first hearing, which is part of why advocates describe outcomes like these as life sentences in everything but name. That detail matters for the 2 who were juveniles, because the relief the Supreme Court opened up was never a promise of release. It only guaranteed that a court had to consider a young offender's age before condemning them to die in prison. In this case, the courts considered it and reached the same conclusion they had reached the first time, which is what has happened in the overwhelming majority of these resentencing fights across the country. As of 2026, all 6 remain incarcerated, and none of them are eligible for parole. Natasha Cornett is still held in the custody of the Tennessee Department of Correction, serving out consecutive sentences that leave her no path to release. In 2001, she was linked to an attack on another inmate, though she was not charged in that instance for a lack of evidence. The child who survived that night is reported to be living in Sweden as an adult now, far from the place where any of it happened. And the surviving family members have spent the years since simply trying to live beyond it. These 4 names are only the start of the list. 4 more young women, each of them sentenced to spend the rest of her life behind bars, are still ahead. Not subscribed yet? Now's the time. And if audio's more your thing, find us on Spotify too. You can click the link in our bio. Tia Skinner. On a November night in 2010, in the small town of Yale, Michigan, two men entered a house through a window and attacked a married couple asleep in their own bed. The couple had done nothing to invite it. They had simply raised a daughter who decided she wanted them gone, and who left the way open for the men who came to do it. Tia Skinner had, on paper, the kind of upbringing that should have pointed somewhere better. Yale, Michigan, is a small town roughly 85 miles northeast of Detroit. The sort of place where a family's business tends to be known to its neighbors and where a crime like this one leaves a permanent mark. She was an honors student and a member of her school band, active in her church, and on track to attend Western Michigan University. Paul and Mara Skinner had adopted her as an infant, after she was born to a mother who was incarcerated, and they had given her a stable and loving home. She was 17, only about a month away from turning 18, when she turned against them. That timing would come to matter enormously, because a few more weeks of age would have placed her outside every legal protection that later applied to her case. The trouble, by every account of the case, came down to a boyfriend her parents did not approve of. Tia wanted the relationship. Her parents stood in the way of it. And rather than wait out their objections, she chose to remove them from the picture entirely. On November 12, 2010, two young men named Jonathan Kurtz and James Preston, both over 18, came into the Skinner home while the family slept and attacked Paul and Mara in their bed. Paul, badly wounded, still managed to chase the attackers out of the house before he collapsed and died. Mara survived, though she had been stabbed 26 times. What made the case against Tia so damning was everything investigators learned she had done to prepare for that night. She had drawn a map of the house and the surrounding neighborhood, left the knives out on her own bed, cut a screen and set a ladder so the men could get in, and worked to keep her brother Jeffrey, a trauma nurse who was in the home, from stepping in to help her parents once the attack was over. This was not a crime of impulse or panic. It was a plan, worked out in advance and carried out by others at her direction. And that distinction would sit at the center of everything the courts wrestled with afterward. Paul Skinner was the adoptive father who, together with his wife Mara, had taken Tia in when she was a baby and built a family around her. In the last moments of his life, he was still trying to protect that family, chasing armed intruders out of his own home before his injuries overcame him. His wife lived through the attack and would later sit through the court proceedings against the daughter they had raised together. For the family that remained, the hardest part was not a stranger's cruelty, but the fact that the plan had come from inside their own home. Mara lost a husband and a daughter on the same night, one to the attack itself and the other to a courtroom. And she has had to live with both losses at once ever since. How do you weigh a sentence for someone who planned a killing but never held the weapon herself? A jury convicted Tia Skinner of first-degree premeditated murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and attempted murder. In 2011, she received the sentence that Michigan law then required: life without the possibility of parole. The two men who carried out the attack were also convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. And because both of them were adults, they had no path to the kind of resentencing that would soon reshape her case. That change came from the Supreme Court's decision in Miller versus Alabama, which held that a mandatory life sentence could not be imposed on a juvenile without first weighing the circumstances of their youth. Skinner's case was sent back for resentencing, and it became the center of a long fight in the Michigan courts over who should decide such a sentence, a judge or a jury. In 2018, the Michigan Supreme Court ruled in her case that a judge could impose it, because the jury's verdict alone had already authorized the punishment. That question sounds technical, but a great deal rested on it. If a jury had been required to make the call, every juvenile serving a life sentence in Michigan would have had grounds to demand a new hearing in front of 12 people rather than one. The court's answer closed that door, and it closed it in a case bearing Tia Skinner's name, which means her conviction now sits in Michigan's law books as the decision other defendants run into when they try the same argument. Years before that ruling, at a resentencing in July of 2013, Judge Daniel Kelly had already made his view plain. He reimposed life without parole and told her that justice demanded she serve every day of it and not one day less, calling her the architect of the entire plan. Mara Skinner, the mother who had survived that night, sat through the proceedings against her own daughter. The United States Supreme Court later declined to take up Tia's petition, leaving the sentence in place. Michigan has since expanded its protections for young offenders in other cases, but those newer rulings applied to defendants who were 18 to 20 at the time of their crimes, not 17. So they have done nothing to move her situation. The two men who broke into the house that night remain in prison as well, still serving the life terms they received. As of 2026, Tia Skinner remains in the custody of the Michigan Department of Corrections, serving life without parole, her sentence reaffirmed at every step of the way. And the young woman a judge once called the architect of the plan has never come close to walking free. Tia Skinner turned on the family that had chosen her and raised her as their own. The betrayal at the center of what comes next cut in a different direction, toward the friends who had taken in a lonely, bullied girl and made her feel for the first time in her life like she truly belonged. Christine Paolilla. For 3 years, the killing of 4 young people in a quiet suburb outside Houston went unsolved, and the person responsible was hiding in plain sight. She had been one of the victims' friends. She had even been voted the most irresistible girl in her high school class. And the thing that finally undid her was not a fingerprint or a witness, but her own confession, made to exactly the wrong person. Christine Paolilla's life had been shaped by loss and hardship long before any of this. She was born on Long Island, New York, in the spring of 1986. Her father was killed in a construction accident when she was 2, and her mother's struggles with addiction meant Christine spent stretches of her childhood in someone else's care. At 7, she developed alopecia, a condition that caused her to lose her hair, her eyebrows, and her eyelashes. And she wore wigs and endured years of bullying because of it. By the time the family moved south to Texas, she was a teenager who had already absorbed a lifetime's worth of instability and who had every reason to want acceptance badly. When they settled in Clear Lake City, 2 well-liked girls took her under their wing, helped her with her appearance, and helped her feel like she fit in. And by 2003, she had been voted the most irresistible girl in her class. For a girl who had spent years being singled out for how she looked, that vote was not a small thing. It was proof that the 2 friends who had adopted her socially had genuinely changed her standing. And it makes what happened afterward harder to account for, because the people who had given her that were the same people she went on to harm. By then, she was 17 and dating a 21-year-old named Christopher Snyder, someone the people closest to her did not trust. On July 18, 2003, the 2 of them went to a home in Clear Lake, reportedly to steal drugs. Inside were 4 young people, and all 4 were shot and killed, 2 of them with one gun and 2 with another. One of the 4, Rachel Coloroutis, survived the initial gunfire and tried to crawl toward a phone to call for help. She did not reach it, and the final blows against her were later attributed to Paulila herself. The scene gave investigators almost nothing to work with, and because one of the victims had reportedly sold drugs out of the home, police first assumed the motive was tied to that world. 2 of the 4 had been the very friends who once welcomed Paulila in. Rachel Colorautis was remembered as warm and kind, drawn to art and writing, and Tiffany Rowell was a gifted young actress who talked about becoming a social worker one day. The 2 young men, Marcus Priscilla and his cousin Adelbert Sanchez, left behind less of a public record, though Priscilla had been Rowell's boyfriend. All 4 were barely out of high school, with the whole of their adult lives still in front of them. The case went cold and stayed that way for about 3 years. What eventually broke it open was Paulila herself. In 2005, she married a man named Justin Rott, who was struggling with heroin addiction, and after seeing a television segment about the unsolved killings, she confessed her role to him. There is a grim irony in that sequence. The publicity meant to generate leads did produce one, though not in the way anyone intended, because the person it reached was the killer, and what it produced in her was the need to tell somebody. Not long after, an anonymous tip came into Crime Stoppers from someone who had been in rehab alongside her and had heard her talk about what she had done. That tip pointed police toward San Antonio, and she was arrested there on July 19, 2006, 3 years and 1 day after the murders. Christopher Snyder was already dead by then, having taken his own life with an overdose only weeks before officers could reach him, which meant the one other person who had been inside that house could never be questioned. So how do you prove a case when the only other witness to it is already gone? Prosecutors built the case on her confession and the evidence surrounding it. And on October 13, 2008, a jury convicted Christine Paulila of capital murder. Because she had been 17 at the time of the killings, the Supreme Court's decision in Roper v. Simmons meant she could not be sentenced to death, and the sentence instead became an automatic term of life in prison. Under Texas law, that carried a requirement that she serve 40 years before she could so much as be considered for parole. Her attorney, a well-known defense lawyer, had argued that Snyder was the true driving force behind the killings, and that her confession could not be trusted because she had given it while in the grip of heroin withdrawal. The jury did not accept it. The Texas 14th Court of Appeals was not persuaded either. And in 2011, it affirmed her conviction and rejected her argument that a mandatory life sentence for someone so young amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. Her later appeals went nowhere. One of the reasons the case had stayed alive long enough to be solved at all was the work of Rachel Colorautis's father, George, who put more than $100,000 toward reward money and mounted a campaign of billboards and flyers to keep his daughter's name in front of the public. Without that pressure, it is entirely possible the killings would have stayed unsolved, and Paulila would have gone on living quietly under everyone's notice. As of 2026, she is held in the Texas prison system, now around 40 years old. And because Texas law requires her to serve 40 years before she is even eligible, her first chance at parole will not come until July of 2046, when she will be in her 60s. The case has since been retold on national news magazine programs and forensic documentary series, which have kept the names of the 4 young people who died in that house in front of the public far longer than most cases manage. It took 3 years to bring Christine Paulila to justice. What happened next unfolded far more quickly, and at its heart was a girl younger than any other name on this list. One of the youngest ever charged as an adult with a crime like this in her part of Pennsylvania. Jamie Silverneck. She was 14 years old, still in the 9th grade, when she helped plan the killing of the person who had given her life. The man who carried it out was a soldier 6 years older than she was, someone she had kept hidden from almost everyone around her. And the evidence that would convict her had been sitting in plain sight the entire time, in the text messages on her own phone. Jamie Silverneck lived in Upper Macungie Township, Pennsylvania, and by outward appearances, she was an ordinary teenager, a 9th grader in a comfortable suburban district outside Allentown. What her family did not fully understand was that she had become involved with Caleb Barnes, a 20-year-old specialist in the United States Army stationed in Maryland, whom she had met at a concert. She told people the two of them were engaged, and Barnes appears to have believed, or at least claimed, that she was pregnant. The relationship had been carried on largely out of sight, through messages and arranged meetings, and by the time the adults around her grasped how serious it had become, it was already well past the point of a passing infatuation. She was 14, which would make her one of the youngest females ever charged as an adult with homicide in Lehigh County. The relationship was the problem at the center of everything. Jamie's mother, Cheryl, had tried to bring it to an end, and prosecutors said she had threatened to report Barnes to the authorities over his involvement with her underage daughter. That threat, according to the case laid out in court, is what sealed her fate. On March 15, 2015, after Jamie, her mother, and Barnes had returned home from a concert together, Barnes attacked and killed Cheryl Silverneck in her own vehicle, in the driveway of the family home. Her body was later found in a shallow grave in South Whitehall Township. What turned the case from a tragedy into something far colder was the trail Jamie had left behind on her phone. The text messages between her and Barnes showed that this had been no sudden act, that Jamie had taken part in planning it and had pressed Barnes to go through with it. And in some of those messages, she made her wishes for her mother chillingly clear. Cheryl Lynn Silverneck was 54 years old, a medical secretary at a Lehigh Valley hospital, a wife and a mother. She had grown up in Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, graduated from high school there in the late 1970s, and had been a cheerleader remembered by her classmates as happy-go-lucky, with a smile that stayed with people for years. She had tried to protect her daughter from a relationship she rightly understood to be dangerous. It was that very effort to protect her that appears to have cost Cheryl her life. She left behind a husband, David, along with a wide circle of people from a small Pennsylvania town who had known her since she was a teenager herself, and who had to absorb not only her death, but the fact that her own child had helped arrange it. What does a court do with a 14-year-old who helped arrange her own mother's death? Jamie was charged as an adult, and her request to move the case into the juvenile system was denied. That decision mattered enormously, because a juvenile disposition might have freed her in her 20s, while the adult system exposed her to a life term. A psychologist who evaluated her testified that she was mature well beyond her years, that she was manipulative, and that she was unlikely to be rehabilitated within the juvenile system. And the court agreed. She then pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and other charges, and she was sentenced to a term of 35 years to life, which was 10 years above the minimum the law required, and which made her one of the youngest women ever held at the state prison in Muncie. Barnes, who took his own case to trial and tried to place the blame on Jamie, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole, plus additional decades. The judge, Maria Dantos, told him he would spend the rest of his natural life locked away. His own appeal was rejected by a state appellate court in 2018. Jamie's case has continued to move through the courts and beyond them. She tried to withdraw her guilty plea, arguing that her lawyer had failed her and that the plea had not been truly informed. But the courts upheld the denial, and the Juvenile Law Center took up her cause before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. In May of 2025, that same organization filed a petition asking the State Board of Pardons to commute her sentence, a request supported by 20 letters, including ones from her father and her maternal grandmother. The filing was made public that September. In Pennsylvania, commuting a life sentence is difficult by design, requiring a unanimous vote of the board and then the governor's signature, which means a single member declining to agree is enough to end the effort entirely. There was also a complication in her case, because one member of the board was the same psychologist who had testified against moving her case to juvenile court years earlier. And after clemency advocates raised objections, the administration indicated he would be asked to step aside from any case he had previously been part of. Even if the commutation effort fails, her sentence of 35 years to life means she is not simply locked away forever without any horizon, the way most of the others on this list are. Though her earliest possible release still sits many years down the road. As of 2026, Jamie Silverneck remains at Muncie, now in her mid-20s, with that petition still pending and no final decision reported. Jamie Silverneck never held the weapon that took her mother's life, and yet the law placed the full weight of that night on her shoulders. The last young woman on this list also never fired the shot that ended a man's life, and she would learn, in a Florida courtroom, just how far the law can reach when a death happens during a crime you helped set in motion. Jennifer Mee. Before she was a convicted killer, she was a national curiosity, a teenage girl who turned up on morning television because she could not stop hiccuping. For a few weeks in 2007, much of the country knew her simply as the Hiccup Girl. A few years later, that same name would appear in a very different kind of headline. Jennifer Mee was 15 when the hiccups began during a science class one January morning in St. Petersburg, Florida, and went on for weeks, coming dozens of times a minute, hour after hour, day after day. Doctors could not find a cause and could not make them stop. The story was strange enough that it traveled fast, and before long she was being interviewed on national morning television. A teenager known across the country simply as the Hiccup Girl, appearing on program after program in the hope that someone watching might know a cure. Eventually, the hiccups faded on their own, roughly 5 weeks after they had started, and so did the attention. Whatever else that period was, it was not a foundation for anything. And once the cameras left, she was an ordinary teenager again, in a life that had never been especially stable. Her life away from those few weeks of fame had never been as bright as the coverage suggested. She ran away from home more than once. She struggled with drug use and with what her defense would later describe as Tourette's syndrome and schizophrenia. And by the time she was 19, she had drifted into far more dangerous company than the film crews who had once followed her around. On October 23, 2010, Mee arranged to meet a young man named Shannon Griffin, someone she had connected with online only days earlier. Under the pretense of buying marijuana, she lured him to a vacant house in St. Petersburg. Waiting inside were 2 other people, Laren Rayford and Lamont Newton, who was Mee's boyfriend at the time, and the plan the 3 of them had was to rob him. Griffin did not simply hand over what he had. He resisted, and in the struggle that followed, he was shot several times and killed. And here is the detail that has always made the case feel so senseless. For a young man's life, the robbery brought in less than $50. Shannon Griffin was 22, a maintenance worker at a Walmart who had recently moved to St. Petersburg from Mississippi, looking for a fresh start after Hurricane Katrina had upended his life. The people who knew him described a genuinely hard worker, someone who had earned his GED and had held down his job for a solid year. He was, by one account, about to take his first paid vacation the very week that he was killed. He and me had been complete strangers until they met online just days before his death. His cousin, who also shared a home with him, spoke afterward with a mix of anger and restraint that stayed with people who heard it, calling the people responsible predators while saying in the same breath that it was a terrible tragedy and that he would not wish it on anyone. That was the kind of family Shannon Griffin had come from, and the kind of life he had been quietly rebuilding when it ended. Investigators did not have to look far. The online trail that had brought Griffin to that house led straight back to me, and once police began pulling on it, the roles each person had played came apart quickly. Me and both of her co-defendants were arrested and charged, and from there, the case moved toward a Florida courtroom. How do you end up sentenced to life for a killing you did not physically commit? The answer lay in Florida's felony murder rule, which allows a person to be charged with murder when a death occurs during the commission of another felony, even if that person never touched the weapon. Because the killing happened during a robbery she had arranged, me was charged with first-degree murder, exposed to the same penalty as the two men who had actually carried out the robbery and the shooting. In the eyes of the law, the person who lures the victim to the trap is just as responsible as the person who fires the weapon. She was found competent to stand trial. The evidence against her was hard to argue with. It included a phone call she made from jail to her mother, in which she said she had not killed anyone but admitted, in the same breath, that she had set the whole thing up and that it had gone wrong. It also included her own DNA, found on the victim's shirt. Over 2 days in September of 2013, a Pinellas County jury heard the case and after only about 4 hours of deliberation, found her guilty. The judge, Nancy Moat Lay, then imposed the only sentence the law allowed her to hand down: life without the possibility of parole. Her two co-defendants were likewise convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life, so that all three of the people in that vacant house would grow old behind bars. Me's efforts to undo the verdict have not succeeded. Her motion for a new trial was denied in 2013, and an appellate court declined to grant her a retrial in 2015. Her case still draws sympathy from some corners, and a public petition has argued for her release on the grounds that she never carried out the killing with her own hands. But none of that has changed the outcome in court. A true crime author published a book about her a few years after the conviction, and the strange arc of her story, from a novelty item on morning television to a life sentence in a Florida prison, has kept her name in circulation in a way that most felony murder cases never manage. There is a bitter symmetry in how it turned out. The girl who once became famous for something she could not control ended up condemned for something she set in motion on purpose. As of 2026, Jennifer Mee remains in the custody of the Florida Department of Corrections, serving a sentence of life without parole for a death she helped arrange, but did not, by her own account, cause herself. Every one of these 8 young women is still behind bars today, and none of them has any real prospect of walking free. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.